Good morning, everyone. Welcome to Breakfast Club. This one is really, really special because we have not only one of our most popular guests, but also our original Breakfast Club guest 27 episodes ago, Dr. Nathalie Nagalingam, our Curator of Botany at the California Academy of Sciences. Hey, Nat.
Hi, everyone.
We're so glad that you're here. And it's so funny because in your first appearance, you talked about ferns, and in your second appearance, you talked about flowers, which you don't even really like that much. And it's not until today that we get to hear about really kind of the love of your plant life, or the focus of your work at least,
yes,
with the cycads.
It's true. These are the loves of my life. Yeah.
Oh, and do you remember how you fell in love, or how you met your first cycad?
Well, I can tell you how I kind of fell in love with cycads. So I started my career off as a paleobotanist, which is somebody who studies fossil plants. So if you go back to Jurassic Park, remember Laura Dern, who was the woman in the story, and she was a scientist, and she was a paleobotanist. And so I started as a paleobotanist, and then I was working on ferns, and then I started learning about cycads and how they're really ancient. And so that's how I started getting into cycads, because they're really ancient.
That's so cool. And what drew you to paleobotany in the first place?
I loved being able to look back into the past, like millions and millions of years ago. It's like there's no other way that you can do that other than fossils. Well, when I first started, but now you can do it with DNA. And so to me, it was just fascinating to be able to study evolution and the past using fossils.
Yeah. I wish that you had been in Jurassic Park instead of Laura Dern, because I remember seeing it as a kid and just being so annoyed by how kind of helpless and non-sciencey she was. So they should redo it, starring Nathalie.
Okay. All right. Okay.
Yes.
I'm available.
Wait, so what did you say?
I'm available.
Oh, okay, good. All right, excellent. So Jurassic Park 17.
Yeah.
So I will remind people watching, you can ask Nathalie questions anytime at all by leaving them in either the comment section of Facebook or the chat box on YouTube, and we'll circle back at the end and ask as many as we can. We always get a ton for you, so get your questions in early. And let me give you your slides. All right, and I'll get out of here and we'll see you at the end. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Laurel. Bye. Hi, everybody. So I just want to start off acknowledging that this is Black Botanist Week. So please head over to Twitter. There's a whole lot of stuff happening on Twitter, a whole bunch of hashtags. If you look up Black Botanist Week, the hashtag, you'll find all these different things. And so I really want to support all of our Black botanists. Unfortunately, there are very few. It's really tough being a minority in science. I can attest to that. And so really we need to support all our Black botanists as much as we can. And one of my favourite Black botanists is Pakamani Zaba, and he is the head of horticultural conservation at the Kirstenbosch Botanic Gardens in South Africa. And here he is saying hello to me during a tour of Kirstenbosch Botanic Garden. He works on cycads, and he was showing me the beautiful, incredible Kirstenbosch Botanic Gardens in Cape Town. And this is what it looks like. It is absolutely stunning. It's one, I think I would say it's probably the best botanic garden I've ever been to. So please go there if you're ever in South Africa. Also there is a very special plant, and I had to have a photo with it. It's called Encephalatus woodii. And the kind of funny thing is that, well, it's not funny, but I used to have this really great intro for my talks where I would talk about, imagine one day where you would wake up and, it was all really quiet around you, and then you went to your coffee shop to get your coffee and that was closed. All the streets were deserted. So I really, I set it up as if you were the last person on this planet. But given the pandemic right now, that intro is completely inappropriate, so I had to totally scrap it. But really, so being the last person on the planet is akin to this particular plant called Encephalatus woodii, which is the last plant on this planet. And so when it was originally found over 100 years ago, only one plant was ever found. It's called wood cycad because Wood was one of the first people to see it. He was the director of Botanic Gardens in Durban, South Africa. And so this plant is a really famous cycad. cycads overall and the ancestors of all cycads lived alongside the dinosaurs. And so whenever you see a picture of dinosaurs, you're going to see something that looks like a cycad. So here we are here. And their relatives, so distant relatives called the Benatites, which are extinct right now, also looked like that as well. And so we describe the time of the dinosaurs in the plant world as the age of cycads, because they were really common and really, really diverse as well, and throughout the world. And so cycads actually arose about the same time as dinosaurs. Again, here's a picture and there's a cycad around the dinosaur, but they actually survived while the dinosaurs died out, or most of them except the birds. And so we actually all know about cycads. It's kind of ingrained in our psyche. Even if you've never even heard of cycads, as a kid, you will draw pictures of dinosaurs, and this is actually a kid's pictures of dinosaurs. And there's something that looks like a cycad always present. We always draw this like palm tree-like thing, but really those aren't palm trees, those are actually cycads. But the thing is, so cycads are really old, but the species are young. And so this is something that I discovered through my research. It's kind of odd or funny that I was drawn to cycads because they're really ancient, but my research using DNA shows that the ancestors to cycads are really old, but all of the species that we see today are actually really young. And so dinosaurs died out 65 million years ago with the big asteroid, but the cycads that we see today arose about 12 million years ago. So that's like a huge amount of difference in terms of when today's species arose versus when the dinosaurs were around. So today's species, they have links back to the dinosaurs. I kind of describe it as their great-great-great-grandparents lived with the dinosaurs. But they look very similar to the fossils. And so this is why they're often called living fossils. And so all the plants that we see today, pretty much all of them, have a trunk. They have a crown of these really beautiful fronds, or you can call them leaves. So this is an individual leaf with leaflets here. And they have cones at the top, and this is an old male cone. If we look at the fossil, same structure. We have the trunk, we have the crown of fronds, and we have a cone as well. Now, this is a pretty remarkable fossil. Most of the stuff that we see is just little like fragmentary leaf remains. So cycads are often mistaken as palms, and their common names often include palm, but really they're related to the pines. And this is because they don't produce any flowers, they produce cones, and their seeds are also different as well from flowering plants. And their overall structure, you can see the trunk here and the crown of leaves, and here are a bunch of seeds, and here's a man here. So this is a really, really old plant. I would say this is over 200 years old because they grow so slowly. Today, there's about 350 species. There's about 10 different genera. And I wrote kind of 350 roughly because we're still discovering more species. There's still, DNA is helping us discover new species, and exploration in poorly explored places are also uncovering new species as well. And also looking more closely at the appearance of the plants reveals that they're different as well. And so we have new species. And they also occur in the tropics and the subtropics. And I like to say they're kind of like me, they like the warm climates. They don't do particularly well in cool climates. And so cycads are really important to us culturally, so much so that in Vanuatu, there are actually cycads on the flag. And so here, this represents a curled frond of a cycad as it's opening. And these two fronds here represent two cycad fronds, and they're crossed over, which indicates that the tribes are at peace. When tribes are at war, the fronds are uncrossed. And this is actually just sort of symbolic, in the native areas. And so when they achieve peace, then they will cross the fronds. And so they've represented that on the flag. Cycads are also used in religious rituals throughout the world. So here are some examples in the Philippines. For Palm Sunday, and instead of palms, cycads are used. They're used in Central America, and also in floral decorations as well. So they're pretty important to us, even though many people don't even know about them. In Australia, where I'm from, the Australian Aborigines have really, really deep connections with cycads. And not all Aboriginal groups. There are about 200 language groups of Aborigines in Australia, each with their own cultural traditions. Some of them have cycads in their area, and they have spirit stories that explain the existence of cycads. They use cycads for food, and here we have a lady who is collecting the seeds, and she's throwing them in a bag, and that bag is put in a creek where the seeds are leached to remove their toxins. They're also economically important. There's songs related to cycads. They're related to people's identity, and there's a huge amount of different words and language associated with using cycads and their seeds, much more than we ever have. And so cycads are really, really important to many, many cultures. The seeds are actually poisonous, as I just alluded to, and so they're actually kind of, some of them are really bright coloured. And I remember when I worked at the Botanic Garden in Sydney, I was walking back from lunch, and there were two women who just saw a cone, and the cones can be really big, and they had just picked the seed. There were signs, and I guess they didn't read them. But there were signs saying, please don't eat the seeds, they're poisonous, and then they started eating the seeds. And I was freaking out, and I was like, don't eat the seeds. But they stopped eating the seeds. But the seeds are really poisonous. So Captain Cook, who was British and was one of the first white people to come to Australia, he and his crew ate the seeds, and they actually were run aground because they got really sick from eating the seeds and had to stay for a while until they all recovered. And they also fed them to their pigs, and the pigs also got sick as well. Generally, farmers don't like cycads because if the animals eat the seeds, they get something called Zania staggers, which is kind of like a neurological disease. And this leads me to the story of what's called the Quam Dementia syndrome. And this was really prevalent after the Second World War, where people in Guam started getting neurological diseases like ALS and Alzheimer's and Parkinson's. And it really wasn't clear what was causing it. And there's really still a lot of debate about why this disease became so prevalent. Some people said it's because people during the war were eating many more cycad seeds. And so here you can see these seeds, and perhaps they didn't detoxify them properly. But in fact, some other researchers have looked, and they found that the seeds, once you cook them on coals, the toxins are significantly reduced. So maybe that is not the case. Another cause of the disease could be the toxins that ended up accumulating in these fruit bats. And you can see this fruit bat has been munching on this particular seed. And what happened is that the people in Guam had such food shortages during the war that they ended up eating a lot more fruit bats. And so that caused a lot of accumulation of the toxin in people. And so it could be that that's why they got the disease. After that generation, that disease is really reduced, and so it's something to do with the war, and it's still unclear. There's a really great book about this if you want to go and read about it. Oliver Sacks wrote extensively about it. It's combined with another story called Island of the Colorblind, but please take a look. It's a really great story about cycads and Oliver Sacks and how he discovered and helped figure out what the problem was. So cycad seeds have these terrible neurotoxins that are also found in the algae that cause algal blooms. so those cyanobacteria. And the seeds need to be detoxified. And what I find amazing is that people all around the world have found different ways to detoxify these seeds. And in some cultures, like the Australian Aborigines, they get that bag, the dilly bag, they put it in the creek and it leaches away all of the water. Other cultures, such as in Central America and elsewhere in Mexico, they get the seeds and put it with coals, and that reduces the toxins. Other peoples soak the seeds in different, in basically a series of water buckets. And so you soak the seeds and then you get rid of the water, and you soak the seeds and get rid of the water. You can test whether the toxins have been eliminated by doing some kind of chemical reaction that involves lime, or, which is another way you could do it, is you get the water, and to test that all the toxins are gone, you give the water to the chickens. And apparently if the chickens are not okay, then you need to keep detoxifying the seeds. But you can detoxify the seeds, and many people have been using cycad seeds as food for millennia. And there's actually archaeological evidence in Central America that people have been using these seeds for like 6,000 years. The Australian Aborigines have been in Australia for 60,000 years, so it's likely they've been using those seeds for thousands and thousands of years too. And so this kind of shows you the process of preparing the seeds. You remove the outer husk, you wash it in a lime solution just to get rid of the final, some of the toxins. Again, you can soak them. Here they're being ground into a kind of paste. This is the paste being made into balls. And here we have some tamales. You can shape them into tamales and cook them, or you can shape them into tortillas. And so they're used alongside maize as a food source. Cycads are also used in traditional medicine. And in South Africa, for example, people use trunks to help deal with headaches and a whole range of other ailments. And so they peel the bark off the trunks, and you can see them here in a traditional medicine market. And so here's another example of one. And so I've heard this used as an example for poachers to say, well, you know, we need to save the plants from the wild, from people using them for traditional medicine. But in fact, when people studied the plants that were used in these traditional markets, they weren't coming from very rare plants, they were coming from common plants. And so that argument of using these cycads, protecting cycads from traditional medicine is actually, you know, completely false and actually really racist. And so going back to wood cycad, this was a pretty old plant. It was found with 4 trunks. And so here you can see 2 of the trunks, and wood is there with them. The fate of the trunks is really interesting. One of the trunks was damaged. 2 of the trunks went to Durban Botanic Garden, and so Wood arranged for them to be dug up and sent to the Durban Botanic Garden. And this is actually one of the original trunks that was taken from the wild. And so here you can see a set of stairs, and so this is a really, really huge plant. That plant from the Durban Botanic Garden, interestingly, was used to name the species. And when we name a species, what we do is we have like the standard, the gold standard of what this species looks like, so that anybody who comes and says, oh, I have a new species or I have the same species, you can compare it to this actual plant that you decided was Encephalitis woodii. And so this particular specimen is what we call the type specimen. And this is what we keep in the herbarium. So at the Academy, we have 500,000 specimens just like this. This is from Kew Gardens. And so those 2 trunks were sent to Durban Botanic Garden. That last damaged trunk, it died of disease in 1964. The 3rd trunk, it's kind of unclear what happened to it. So this is the 4th trunk. And so given there were 4 trunks and all 4 trunks have gone, And all of that area in Nagoya in South Africa has been scoured to try and find another plant of Encephalitis woodii, and none have been found. And so this means when we categorize it, it's actually categorized as extinct in the wild. And so really the worst category is extinct, which is, so for example, the dodo, which is from Mauritius, where I am from. So it's not extinct, but it's actually extinct in the wild because there are no other plants of the species known. The thing with wood cycad is that it produces only pollen cones, and this is a really huge pollen cone. It's I'm not, probably like 3 feet, 2-3 feet. I'm not very good with non-metric. It's about, I'd say it's about a metre. It's really, really huge, and it was in one of the Academy's exhibits and is now in my office right now. And so wood cycad only produces pollen cones, and what this means is that wood cycad is a male plant. And the thing with cycads is that they are either male or female. So we have a cycad here. This is a pollen cone, and so this plant is male. This plant is female. My friend Simon took this photograph for me. So I have a bunch of people now, because I love cycads. They send me photos of cycads. So they're part of the cycad spotting crew for me. And so this is a female plant and this is a male plant. One of the really fascinating things is that typically they stay female or male, but we don't really know why they are female or male. People have tried to find the genes or chromosomes, and we don't really know why they are one sex or other. On very, very, very rare occasions, like less than 5, there have been examples of female plants that in really, really harsh conditions, like extreme drought, really high temperatures, the female plants, instead of producing a female cone, produce a male cone. But then when the conditions are much better, they revert to being female. And so because producing seeds and a cone is a lot of investment, it's probably that it's easier for them to reproduce as a male. And so they just sort of briefly produce a pollen cone, but revert back to female. So what we get is a range of, we get the pollen cones, which is male, and then we get the female seed cones or ovule cones. And so we need to get pollination happening. And the way that happens is through insect pollination. There's a tiny little bit of wind pollination, but most of the pollination is through insects. And here you can see all these beetles. There are beetles and another group of insects called thrips that pollinate these cones. They were reproduced by this really fascinating method called pull-push. What happens is that the cycad cones will heat up, even warmer to the ambient temperature and regardless of the ambient temperature. They'll heat up several degrees Celsius, and they will also emit some odours. And so the odours will attract the insects, and those odours are actually specific to each particular cycad species. So they attract a particular species of insect, and so those are really specific as well. Those odours bring in all the insects to the male cone, and they feed and they mate, and then what happens is that the cone produces way too much odour, and it actually actively pushes the insects away. So it pulls them in with a tiny little bit of odour and pushes them away with a lot of odour. And I've seen it compared to wearing some cologne. So if you wear like a little bit of cologne, it's really nice, and you're like, oh, that smells nice. But if you're wearing a lot of cologne, and then everyone's like, oh, that's a bit too stinky, and then they don't want to be near you. So it's like cycads are ramping up the cologne and getting rid of the insects. And then the next phase is that the female cones produce a little bit of odour, and so that brings the insects to the female cones. But they also have this other system where they produce some other volatiles, and then that actually makes the insects not want to stay on the female cone for too long. So really they stay on the male cones for most of the time and feed, and they actually mate and lay their eggs in the male cone. And then we always compare, we always think flowers are amazing, and especially botanists, we're all like, flowers do amazing things. But really, flowers only attract insects through that pull system. They attract them through rewards, like nectar or odour. And so cycads actually have a much more complex system of pollination. And it's likely this cycad system has been around for millions and millions of years. There's actually fossils that show insects in the pollen cones where they've laid eggs, and there's little channels where they're fed on the cones as well. So these insects have this really long association with cycads. And this fossil is like 200 million years old, and it was found in Antarctica. So these cycads are really important to the insects. If these cycads are not around, those insects have nowhere to eat and then have nowhere to lay their eggs. And so the cycads have tailored their particular odour profile to individual beetle species. And we still don't know a lot about these beetle species either and what pollinates the cycads. And so if we go back to wood cycad, there were only male plants ever found. And so this poor cycad is never going to reproduce. There is only one particular genetic profile of this cycad, this one particular plant. And so this is a sad cycad that is all alone. There are no other cycads like it. And it's akin to many other animal stories like the Galapagos tortoise or the last male white rhino, where there are no other members of its species around. But unlike animals, cycads produce clones. And this is kind of the saving grace of this species, is that, and many cycad species too do this, and this is not wood cycad, but this is another species of cycad. And so on this trunk here, there's little clones that they produce, and we call them pups. So here's one, there's another little one here, and there's another one here. And what you can do is you can gently pry them off, put them in soil, and then they will start to grow into a completely new plant. Here is another one where there were the pups at the base of the plant. And so now you've got four at the back, 4 really mature plants. And so they're all clones of the individual first plant. Just like we saw with the wood cycad, those 4 trunks were all clones of that same plant. And so one of those clones that was from the original plant, so one of those little ones at the base of the plant, like a tiny one, is this particular one growing in Kirstenbosch Botanic Garden. And so as a kind of cycad nut, of course I had to have my photo with that. And so this plant has been growing since 1916. So this is about 100 years of growth. A clone also went to Kew Gardens, again as one of those little clones at the base of the plant from the wild. And this has been growing at Kew since 1899, and it's considered one of the oldest potted plants in the world. And I visited Kew a couple of years ago, and this is actually off display because they were renovating the temperate house where it usually is. And for me, visiting this plant was almost like a religious pilgrimage. It was just fascinating to see this really famous plant that I talked about in many talks. And so there are cycads, there are plants of woods cycad growing all around the world now. And there's a plant growing at Montgomery Botanic Centre, which specialises in cycads and palms and their conservation. And so here they're growing one of those pups. This is a really big one of wood cycad. And the fascinating thing is this one came from a plant from Longwood Gardens, and the Longwood Gardens plant came from an offset from the Durban Botanic Gardens. So it's linked all the way back. We know the direct ancestry all the way back to those wild plants. And the clones for wood cycad, of course, are really expensive and highly prized. And so at the Huntington Garden, they what they've done is around the wood cycad, they have put this chain here, this kind of fencing, and you can see this very sturdy lock. And so what this does, and basically the cycads are growing in amongst all of this, so you can't steal this plant. Each individual clone, each one of these little pups is probably worth about $30,000 because they're so rare. And in fact, people are crazy about cycads. So I'm crazy about cycads, and my goal is to conserve them. There are also people who love cycads as well, and they have personal collections of cycads. And so here is an example of somebody's private collection of cycads. When I went to South Africa a couple of years ago, we were really fortunate to see a private collection of cycads. And this is actually a wood cycad. So this must be from one of the original offsets, because this plant is absolutely huge. I mean, this is a normal house. And so this, you know, is probably, I don't know, I'm not even sure, several meters tall. And so when we were there, I asked a fellow cycad enthusiast who knows much more about the trade than I do, and I asked him, how expensive do you think that wood cycad would be? And he said to me, easily $1 million. So that's how expensive these really rare plants are. And some of the cheaper plants, I guess, and these are sold all over by collectors. And this is the text from an email listserv that I'm on, and they talk about cycads, and people sometimes sell cycads. And so here's a Coke can so you can get an idea of scale. And what it said in the email, so you know how much it costs, is the two plants on the right are, this is American, $3,250 each. And the bigger one on the left is $4,000. And this is Cycas kansiana, which is not particularly rare, but it's not particularly common either. And the reason that cycads are so expensive is that they also grow so slowly as well. So something like this would probably be about 15, 20 years old. On the other hand, we also have cycads that are really common. And so when I talked about cycad spotting, and so when I went to Disneyland, of course, I was cycad spotting, and this is from the Bugs Life area in Disneyland, and I spotted a cycad. Actually, there's a lot of cycads in Disneyland, which made me really excited. But I saw this one called the cardboard cycad, or it's often called the cardboard palm. So if you ever see it, go and feel the leaves, because the leaves are actually really tough, just like cardboard. And so cycads can be really common. They can be propagated really easily, and they're used in landscaping. I spotted some cycads being sold at the Berkeley Whole Foods, and so here are the plants called Sago Palm, but actually they're cycads. I've also seen them, you know, all around San Francisco and the Bay Area. Whenever I travel anywhere, I take photos of them. And they're also sold at IKEA as well. But really, many species are really rare and threatened. And this is a national park in Australia, so it's well protected. And you can see there's one plant here and one plant here. So they're pretty rare in the landscape in some cases. And rare species are really highly prized, and people will go to huge lengths to get all of the species, all of these 350 species in their collection. So much so that they will go and steal these plants. And so again, this is Kirstenbosch, and this is Pacamani again. And this is after plants were poached in the Botanic garden in Kirstenbosch. And having been there, this is not like easy to get to. This is way in the garden. These plants are microchipped. There's security. But people went into the garden and they stole a bunch of plants. So here are the leaves. They've cut the leaves off, and they've dug up this plant and this plant and this plant. You can see other plants have not been stolen, and those because those plants were not the ones that were targeted. They were not the ones that the poachers wanted. I've also put this picture of Encephalitis woodii as an insect, And you can see that there's a cage at the bottom of the woody eye. That's the one that I was sitting in front of before. And this cage here is because people had stole the offsets of that too. And so this is to protect any offsets that end up being produced. People also poach plants from the wild. And so here we have a kind of cartoon showing people, stealing whole plants from the wild like this. And they do, they steal huge trunks. So here are some trunks that have been stolen. And in many cases, these plants are taken, they may not survive once they're confiscated. And remember that the insects need these plants to survive. And so by poaching these plants, you're actually causing the extinction of some of these insect species too. In some cases, for example, in South Africa, there are armed guards that look after these populations because people go and steal them. And in some cases, people have gone to jail because they've been caught, and really hefty, not like a couple of months, but like a couple of years. And people have also been shot and killed because these plants are protected by armed guards. So just like rhinos are protected by armed guards, cycads are also protected by armed guards. When we have these really rare species and we grow them in botanic gardens, unfortunately we have to keep them behind locked gates. And so here Gary is in charge of the cycads at Huntington Gardens. And so this is just one of the many layers of security. You can see this really big chain to protect these cycads, these really rare species. And sometimes we're really lucky and the poachers are caught. And so, for example, some plants were intercepted in a big sting here in the US. And these plants were actually planted in botanic gardens, in several botanic gardens. And so luckily we can rescue some of these plants. And indeed, I've used some of these plants for my research in helping conserve cycads too. And the reason poaching is really devastating is that because cycads grow really, really slowly. So here's an example of a seed, and this is the first leaf that it's produced. And this plant is about 1 or 2 years old. And so if it takes this long for the plant to produce one leaf, you can imagine how long it's going to take for a plant to become a big leaf, a big trunk with many, many leaves. It takes 10s, 20, 30 years. So once you steal the plants from the wild, they're not going to grow back quickly to recover. It's going to take centuries for those populations to recover. Also, you can't basically share seeds between different regions. So once you remove them from an area, the seeds don't travel very far. And so here there's a female plant here, and all of the seeds have dropped close to it. So you can see that once you remove all of these plants from this area, there aren't going to be other plants that can take its place, and the seeds are not going to travel from elsewhere. And other than poaching, the other major threat to cycads is that there's land clearing. And so these are areas that I visited as part of my fieldwork to collect cycads. And there should have been cycads there. And what's happened is that the cycads have been cleared, and now there are no cycads. And so this is often done with land development and for agricultural purposes too. And so the picture for cycads is not great. And so this kind of shows you the sort of worldwide distribution of cycads. And each individual pie chart shows what level of threat the species are at. And so this is quite old, so this is actually probably more on the positive side. Things have become worse since this image was produced. But in Australia, for example, so this pie chart here, we have about half of the species are near threatened. We have some endangered, endangered and vulnerable species. Sorry, at least half of them are least concern. We have some near threatened, vulnerable and endangered species. So as you get towards the sort of more warmer colours, things are sort of worse. And then the other extreme is South Africa. where we have those extinct in the wild species, and there are a bunch of those in South Africa, so including wood cycad. We have a bunch of critically endangered species, and so most of the species in South Africa are really at risk. And just to sort of point out, there's one species in Japan, which is the Sago Palm, and that's growing everywhere, so there's no risk for that. But mostly everywhere around the world, cycads are at risk. And so when we think of endangered species, and this is from a Google search, I just typed in endangered species, and this is what comes up. And as a botanist, I find this really frustrating because, and I'm sure, you know, invertebrate zoologists also find it frustrating because this is all really biased towards mammals. But there are many species that are endangered, including many plants. And so when we think of endangered plants, this is what comes up. You know, things like the orchid, Venus flytraps, lilies. This is Rafflesia, a parasitic plant, the biggest flower, a giant flower. And so again, this is what comes up as endangered plants on a Google search. But most people don't know that cycads are actually the most endangered group of anything. And when we tally up all of the species at risk for each group, we find that 2/3 of all cycad species are threatened in some way. And if we compare these to other groups of species, so say the frogs, corals, conifers, mammals, which we always talk about, many, many fewer species are at risk. And so cycads are the most endangered group, which means there is a lot of work that we need to do to conserve the cycads. And so this sort of is driving a lot of my work, and there are many people throughout the world who, well, I wouldn't say many, there's a group of people throughout the world who are trying to conserve cycads. One way that this is done is through making sure that the plants in the wild are protected. And so different organisations and governments throughout the world create what we call management plans to make sure that these plants are well looked after. We can also, and so that's called in situ conservation. So that means like in conservation in place, in situ. We can also have conservation ex situ, which means outside of the wild, so outside of the place. And so, for example, there are cycads being grown in various botanic gardens. So I talked about Montgomery before. This is Lowveld in South Africa. And these plants are conservation plants to help preserve the species that are at risk, especially ones that are at risk from poachers. And again, you can see there's these high fences around here to protect these plants. There are also many cycad horticulturalists and scientists from all across the world. Here I am over here, and we meet every few years. So our last meeting was a few years ago in South Africa. Our previous meeting was in Colombia, and here we are. We call the IUCN Cycad Specialist Group. And we devise strategies on how we want to conserve cycads and how we as a group want to educate people about cycads. And so my work, after starting my career as a paleobotanist and learning that cycads were actually really young, I was shocked to learn that cycads are the most endangered group. And so I completely changed all my research to focus on cycad conservation. And so I'm just going to give you like a little snippet of some of my research projects and some of the work that my lab group is doing trying to conserve cycads. And so we're using cutting edge technology to do this. And so I kind of like this ancient plant being saved through cutting edge technology. And one of the ways that we're doing this is through genomics. And so what we're using in the past has been individual genes. And so genes just represent a small proportion of the genome. And when we look at our data, it's like 2 kilobytes of data when we use genetic data from genes. We can scale up to genomics, and we can get up to 1 gigabyte of data per individual. And the way I like to think about this is, in the past, we were using genes. So the genes are kind of like understanding Shakespeare through looking at one sonnet. So we can look at the way he wrote, we can look at the words he used, maybe some of the patterns that occur within the sonnet. But really, if we want to get a really full understanding of Shakespeare, what we need is his collected works. And so this is his volume of works. And really, we can get information about how things changed over time. We can be much more confident in the language that he used, in the themes that he addressed. And so we can get information from genes, so like sonnets, but we can get a lot more information from genomics, so the collected works. And so that's what my group has been doing, is we're pioneering using genomics for Cycads and their conservation. And I've got little icons to explain each individual sort of area of research. So this is like a little seedling, which is not a cycad. And so what we're doing is using genomics to identify what particular groups of plants per species that we want to prioritise for conservation. So here's an example in Australia. So this is in sort of the central northern bit of Australia, called Cycad calcicola. And this plant, this was terrible to collect. It was like super hot. There were mosquitoes. The plant grows on limestone, hence it's called calcicola because of the calcium. So there were like little sinkholes, there were grasses. Anyway, we collected these plants. We collect about 10 plants for each population that we see. And this was growing in Litchfield National Park in the Northern Territory of Australia. The same species grows in the Katherine region, also in the Northern Territory. And I absolutely love this picture because it shows you how we have that really iconic red dirt of Australia. And when we were doing field trip, this is with my PhD student, James, someone told us about a particular population of this species growing at Charles Darwin University. And so it was wonderful. We just turned up at this university, knocked on the door of the main building and, spoke to somebody, and they, introduced us to the director. And I said, I heard you have Cycad. Would you mind if we collected them? And he was like, sure, follow me. So we followed him out to these big paddocks because this is an agricultural university, and there are cattle grazing here as well. And you can see the cycads growing in the grass here. And so we collected plants from this particular location too. And to give you an idea of where it is, so here's the map of Australia, and this is the area that we're looking at inside this black box. We have Darwin, which is the capital of the Northern Territory. So we drove from Darwin to Litchfield, which is a couple of hours. And that's where we collected the first set of plants, so the one with the mosquitoes and the holes and the grass. And then it's a 3-hour drive all the way down to Katherine, and we sampled plants there. We also sampled plants from botanic gardens all around the world as well. And looking at the genetics of this, what we use is the genomic data, and each individual dot represents a particular plant. And each individual population, so a location with a group of species, is represented by a different colour. And so the circles represent one population, and the dots are a plant in that population. And then we cluster the plants based on their genomic data, so how similar they are. If they're more similar, then they're going to cluster more closely together in this graph. And what's really distinct is that there's 2 groups. So this tells us there are 2 genetic groups for Cycas calcicola, and it also tells us all of the cultivated plants that we got are linked to the Katherine group, the Katherine genetic group. And so this tells us that there's this unique genetic diversity in the Litchfield group that is not represented in botanic gardens. And so in terms of conservation, this is leading us to say that we need to develop two different conservation strategies for these two groups, because conserving the Litchfield group isn't going to cover conservation for the Catherine group. So we need to make sure we're conserving both of these plants and have different management plans for both of these. We also need to make sure that the Botanic Gardens have some of the Litchfield group collected and preserved in those Botanic Gardens. And so the reason we want to preserve some of these plants in Botanic Gardens is that we don't know what's going to happen. We can have things like climate change, we can have really harsh fires that may wipe these plants out. We just don't know. There could be a virus that comes in and wipes those plants out. So we want to create a group of plants in the Botanic Garden to make sure we have them as a backup for what's in the wild. Another project that we've been working on, and I've got this like in a little pot over here, a planted pot, is what we're creating is a cycad zoo. And this is for another species that is extinct in the wild, a relative of the wood cycad. And this is Encephalados hirsutus. And again, it's kept behind locked gates. And what we're doing is we're trying to create a group of these plants that are genetically diverse. If you remember, cycads produce clones, and we don't want to have a population of cycads of this species that are all clones. So what we're doing is we're collecting samples from plants in gardens, and collectors are also helping us as well. And so they're sending us samples of the leaves, and this is silica gel. And, you know, when you buy, you know, like shoes or a bag, you get those little packets of silica gel, those desiccants. That's exactly what we use to dry out the leaves. And that helps preserve the DNA for our genomic studies. And so we did a pilot study. And so what we're using is the genomics to figure out whether these plants that are in different collections are clones or whether they're separate plants. They were separate individuals. And so what I did was I looked at the DNA of these different plants, and each individual plant I've given a different colour. So these are the highest matches in the DNA that I found. And none of them were at 100%, which is really reassuring. So it means that we have a bunch of genetic diversity in different plants in different collectors. And so, for example, collector 2 has a plant that is 65% similar to a plant that collector 1 has. And then similarly, collector 3 has a plant that is 62% similar to a plant that collector 1 has. And our goal is to then wait for these offsets to be produced and make sure that we have an example of every unique DNA profile to create what we call an assurance colony, or kind of like a Noah's Ark for these cycads. And this is basically a cycad zoo that we're trying to create. And so this is a pilot study based on Encephalados hirsutus. And then the last thing that I want to tell you about is a completely different technology, which is using drones to monitor cycad health and their populations. And so this is work that completely is the brainchild of my postdoc, Manuel Lujan. And he went to the north of Australia, so the pointy bit of Australia, which is super remote. There are no more roads anywhere. I mean, there's no paved roads anywhere. And he even had to go on a helicopter to collect some plants. They're that remote. And so he came up with this idea, and what he did was he went to a botanic garden and he tested it to see whether we could see these plants, whether you can identify cycads using drone footage. And here he is. Here's the footage that he shot. I'll show that again. And so he's flying over. Here they are down there. And so you can see these really distinctive shapes of the cycad from the top. So looking over, they're very, very distinctive. So then he went out into the field in Australia and shot footage of some plants in the wild. And here's our collaborator, Patrick Griffith, who is the director of Montgomery Botanic Centre. And this is over an old gold mine, and you can see these cycads really clearly. Actually, this one has seeds on it. This one has seeds on it. And they're really distinct in this footage. And so what Manuel has been doing is he's been counting these plants with the help of some of our high school interns. He's been counting these plants and he's hoping to automate this whole process. And we're partnering with some Silicon Valley companies who are helping us develop models and algorithms to actually identify these plants using AI and counting them and figuring out how many plants there are in a population, so that we can go back in the future and keep comparing what these plants look like. Are we getting more plants being produced? Are these plants healthy? Are they dying? This is really a way that we can monitor these plants. So, for example, in Australia and in places like South Africa, where populations are really remote, and also plants are poached as well, we can try and use this technology to do this long-term monitoring of the populations. And so with that, these are projects that I'm doing with my lab, but how can you conserve cycads? I hope by the end that you love cycads as much as I do now. You can grow cycads. There are cycads, the Sago Palm, which are really common and which are really easy to purchase. They produce a lot of offsets. You can see this one here is already producing offsets. And so those are really easy to propagate. And you can purchase those from reputable nurseries if you want some more rare species. There are also reputable nurseries. And you can ask them for their paperwork. They have to have paperwork to show that they have this plant legitimately and it was from legitimate sources. Another way that you can support the kind of work we do is to visit your botanic gardens, visit museums like the Academy, support us through memberships, and help us keep doing this work. And so places like Montgomery, what they've done here is they're actually pollinating the plants. And so this blue ribbon indicates that this plant here was pollinated, so that they can produce seeds to produce more plants. And this helps us increase the number of plants for these really rare and threatened species as well. And with that, I will say thank you for joining me, and thank you to all of the people who have been involved in the work. James was my PhD student who worked on the Cycads calcicola stuff. Vanessa has been helping me with Encephalitis hirsutus, and Manuel has been responsible for the drone project. Thank you.
Natalie, thank you. That was so cool. People loved it. And Christina says, please take me cycad spotting in Disneyland, which I would also, I think you should set up a field trip for adults.
Yeah.
We could, yeah, you should do it. And everybody who signs up donates to the Cycad Relief Fund. And yeah, it would be a surreal day.
Okay, that would be great.
Okay. Kate would like to know, how old do individual cycads get?
We don't really know. There's some plants in Botanic Gardens that are probably 100 years old. That one from Kew is more than 100 years old. Yeah, I'm guessing, 200, 300 years old.
Wow.
I mean, they definitely die. They don't last forever, but, they can be as tall as a 2-story building. I've been to populations where I can't reach the plants because they're so tall.
That's wild. Let's go to Elon. Sorry if I'm saying that wrong. She would like to know whether scientists understand why cycads evolved to have poisonous seeds, like what they're defending against specifically, she asks.
That is a fantastic question. It is thought that it stops animals from grazing on them. So, like the cattle, they get poisoned by it. Some people have thought maybe it's because of the dinosaurs. So maybe the dinosaurs weren't affected by those neurotoxins, but other animals were. And so it's not really clear, but it's some kind of deterrent. Okay.
It's kind of funny to think about dinosaurs wandering around with neurological agents at play.
I think there's a fossil that was found really recently, and I completely forgot to include it, that had a dinosaur that has cycad seeds in its gut.
That's so cool.
This was it's our first evidence to show that dinosaurs were eating cycads. It was always like tantalizing.
Yeah.
But we finally have a fossil that shows it.
Oh, that's cool. That was the first definitive proof.
Yeah, yeah.
That's awesome. This one's from Catherine. She asks, are there chemical tracers that can be used to detect in bones which ancient vertebrates may have eaten cycads?
Not that I know of. No, I don't. Yeah, that's no. I can't think of any. We can detect. This is sort of kind of off topic, but we can detect the isotopic signature of where plants are growing. And so this is one of the cool conservation projects that a postdoc is doing. And so what he's doing is looking at the isotopic signature of plants in the wild and comparing that to plants growing in botanic gardens. And so if you have if a poacher has a plant and you find that plant, you can say, okay, you stole that plant from the wild because the leaves have that isotopic signature of the wild plant.
Wow. Okay, that's really cool. We got to actually, people were really fascinated. It kind of blew so many people's minds that plants are stolen or are poached. So we do have some, let me see, I'll jump to this one from Shayla. She says, I didn't get the last name. You'll have to check later. She says, do you know anything about how private collectors and poachers meet each other or communicate in the first place? It blows my mind that people steal plants.
I mean, there are societies, cycad societies, but many of those people are entirely reputable. I think, like there's like the dark web and that kind of stuff. I don't know, people who do that kind of stuff are all sort of, in with each other. I don't know.
It's such a weird world.
Law-abiding person, so I don't do that kind of thing. Yeah,
we're too good to have that information. And you find those stories in science in all kinds of weird places with like individual fish or tiny little anything really. It's like wherever things are very, very rare, there's a human who suddenly needs to own it.
Unfortunately,
yeah. Riyadh, and I'm sorry if I'm saying that wrong, asks, does the U.S. require permits for the trade and ownership of cycads? In South Africa, one does require a permit, and cycad theft is a problem.
Yeah, so South Africa, is a really most extreme. You don't need permits just in Australia, and in the US. But if you want to import cycads, so for me, I'll collect cycads in Australia. I need to have all the permits to collect them. I need to have permits to export them. And it's like not trivial. You have to write a report and show you're bona fide. So I have to have permits to export them from Australia. I have to have permits to import them into the US. The herbarium has to have permits to have them. Every single cycad species, their trade is controlled by what we call CITES. And so you have to have permits for everything. Within the country, not so.
Okay. Tamara would like me to tell you that she loves your talk and she's been excited for it since your fern talk. And so she's happy that you're covering cycads now. And she also wants us to know, just for a laugh, that apparently the auto-generated captions keep changing cycads to psychics. So it looks like a very different kind of presentation. That's pretty good. Okay, so going back to questions that came in sort of in the earlier part of the presentation, John asks, do most plants come in two genders? And what is the advantage of doing so? It seems like that would lower your chances of survival.
No, I mean, all plants will have male and female to reproduce. There are, pine, some plants have separate male and female plants. Some plants have male and female on the same plant. And we have all these, really amazing botanical terms to describe every single variation. The advantage of that is that you have to have some kind of crossing. And so it's obligate, we call it obligate outcrossing. And so you maintain genetic diversity. If you have male and female on the same plant, you have to have complex genetic mechanisms to make sure you don't inbreed. And so when you inbreed, you get less genetic diversity, which means you're sort of less genetically resilient. And so we have, and this is again work that Manuel is doing, is that even though cycads are really rare and you have very few plants, there's actually quite a lot of genetic diversity in those individual species. And we think that it's because they have to outcross with each other, which is really great. So that's probably why some of those species have survived, even though they're so low in actual numbers of plants.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Oh, neat. Yeah. And then when you were talking about the insects that pollinate the cycads, several viewers asked whether the smells that you mentioned from the male and female plants can actually be detected by humans.
I think so. There's something in my brain where there's like there's some like really, you kind of can whiff, like they can get like a little whiff, and I can't remember now that discussion, but I remember somebody saying that you can kind of faintly smell it when these plants are producing those odors.
But you don't have a memory of having smelled it yourself, so it must be somewhat faint.
No, I know. I think I know someone's told me about it.
Yeah.
But really, those plants are not. Those smells are not designed for us. They're
right.
Really.
Yeah. So this question is from a YouTube user who they're asking whether CITES regulations actually inhibit cycad research in any way, like whether that's a difficult thing to work around, I imagine.
Yes, it's difficult, but it means we have to get the permit, and of course, we want to make sure we do everything properly. And so, it's not a problem. We really, we have the right permits, and so we're allowed to do that kind of work.
Right.
I think that one of the frustrating things is, like we found in Australia, in that we wanted to collect seeds to grow in a botanic garden. And some of the local government authorities were like, oh no, these plants are growing in a national park, they're fine. But we don't know what's going to happen in the wild. So we need those plants. We need to plant some of those seeds in botanic gardens. And so, it's also a problem of educating people who are making those decisions as well, why we need these, to preserve these plants outside of national parks too. Right.
That kind of leads into Aylin's question, which is, well, you asked this a little bit, or answered this a bit, but she says, can you start a Save the Cycads campaign? I'll donate. Also, I'm available to foster any cycads that need a home.
Oh.
I know. But it is a nice question in that you mentioned some of the, sorry, I've got some background noise out here. You mentioned some of the ways that people could support cycads just generally, but in terms of directly supporting the kind of research that you're involved in, is there a more direct way to do that if people want to?
Oh yeah, I mean, if people want to donate to my research, I would be super thrilled. That project with creating the Cycad Zoo, I was trying to apply for National Geographic money, and then National Geographic just postponed the date for the grant applications. And grant applications are really hard anyway. Like it's hard to get grants, but so any support would be wonderful.
Okay, should we drop a link to your lab, or we'll connect offline and we'll drop some links to resources for that for anyone who wants to. Also, I will do the social media for your Cycad Zoo because that just sounds adorable and I feel like there's a lot of potential there. Okay, we'll end with this one from Rachel, who says, hi from an Academy member and would like to know, are there any cycads in San Francisco's Botanic Gardens that we can see?
Yes, yeah, so go to the Ancient Plant Walk and there are a bunch of cycads in that walk. There's some, and sort of in the lead up to the walk, and there's a few different genera and different species, so please go there, especially you'll see the Encephalatos, and actually a couple of those plants were from one of those big busts that, that sting, from Fish and Wildlife, and so those are growing there as well.
Okay. Oh, cool. All right. That sounds good. Nathalie, thank you so much again. You'll have to start thinking about what your fourth talk will be. I don't know what topic you haven't, botanical topic you haven't.
Oh, before we go, I want to show people my Cycad jewelry.
Oh yeah, this is the favorite part, when you share things at the end.
Yeah, so this is my, my obsession is things related to the stuff I study. And so this is a Cycad cone. So it's a giant cone of a cycad. That's one of the earrings. Here's a little
make it bigger. Oops, hang on. I'm gonna remove my. I popped back on because your sound got weird for a second. What did you just say?
That was a cycad cone as well, a little one.
Cycad cone.
And then this is a cycad cone with the fronds. And so these are my favorite. This is my favorite cycad jewelry. It's very hard to get cycad things, not like fern things, which are really common.
Not like corpse flower jewelry.
Yeah. So they're very. These are very dearly loved.
Yeah, they're beautiful. Okay, any plants for us to help you name today?
No, I do not grow cycads.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you again so much. And yes, everyone watching, we will go ahead and drop links to the resources that Nathalie mentioned in the comments later. Also, we will drop a link to her Twitter profile, which is a great way to follow her and keep up with her work. And yes, we hope you come back very, very soon.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.